Oh, welcome to the 39 Gen podcast from Yosan University, and I've got a really interesting guest with me today. Now, would you like to tell people who you are and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Tim Ross, and I'm a doctor of Chinese medicine.
That's awesome.
My background is I grew up in Orange County, and I grew up surfing, and I always thought that I like to say that was my introduction to Taoism because I would wear the Town and Country clothes with the little yin yang symbol. That was like the logo for Town and Country, the little surf clothing manufacturer. Anyway, I mean, I think that it influences like particularly like the idea of going with the flow, and
Yeah.
um, and also, I mean, it's significant study of climactic factors, and being able to harness your study of the climactic factors in order to be in the right place at the right time to have a cool experience. It's like the wind blowing in the southern hemisphere will create a swell that arrives 2 weeks later, and then depending upon the bathymetry and the tide and the wind locally, then a certain surf spot will be the best surf spot to be at. And maybe there's some relationship to that type of thought process to how the classical notions of the relationship of the human with the cosmos and how their health is necessarily impacted by these currents in the sky and in the heavens, terrestrial and celestial movements, and so on and so forth. Anyway, yeah. So,
Yeah.
doing all that stuff, we that led to going to school at UCSD. I wanted to live in La Jolla because I wanted to surf the surf spots in La Jolla. That was
Yeah.
about the extent of that. That was what determined my college. What was yeah. And UCSD is pretty much like a school to go to study biology. It was
Yeah.
it's a really good school. I think it has like the number three most Nobel laureates of any university in California behind Berkeley and Caltech. More Nobel laureates than USC or UCLA. UCSD just didn't have a football team, but UCLA, USC, they don't have their own beach.
Yeah, right?
USC is right on the cliffs at Blacks, and
Yeah.
right, and so that's where the Torrey Pines Research Park is, and where this where kind of like the molecular biology revolution was happening, and Kerry Mullins got the Nobel Prize for doing the polymerase chain reaction, like DNA sequencing technology, and so it was like if you're gonna, yeah, so that led me to study biology and study neuroscience. That was my undergraduate degree, neuroscience and mammalian physiology, and that's where everything started. Essentially, studying, doing the pre med stuff, and studying. We had to do like a dimensions of culture thing, and so I
Yeah.
did Chinese philosophy and or Asian philosophy. So it was like Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism, and very superficial, but that's also where I got into doing Chinese martial arts. Actually, I guess I should be more accurate. It's where I started studying Shirinji Kempo, which is the Japanese version of but it has a unique Japanese characteristic to it, And we, anyway, the Sifu or the sensei had significant judo background, and so we did a lot of grappling and but that's become kind of like the trend. Essentially, there's some kind of philosophical bent. There's training in the martial arts, and there's studying medicine, practicing medicine, and and I also did a lot of research there. I was in the lab a lot. I spent. It was so much fun. All that stuff, like living there. It was like that's the pinnacle, isn't it? Being like 18 to 22 and just like
Right.
surfing and going to school and working. Anyway, the lab was fun because there was a bar on campus, so we could go from like we'd set up our experiments. We'd have to wait 4 hours, and we'd go to the bar. And anyway, things I remember, like I ended up working in the neuroscience lab for Dr. Beer, and I was like doing genetic recombinant research in fruit flies. And so I had
Wow.
like yeah, and weird stuff, I had like a closet where we kept the flies, and I would have trays with like 36 jars of different genetic recombinant flies that I'm breeding essentially. And then I would have to collect them after mating to collect the super young ones that I could then breed, crossbreed with, and just weird stuff, you know? But it's informative, you know? I mean, that was some experience essentially working with like a model organism, a animal model. Um, and yeah, and that's some introduction. I think that's a significant. I think back and I'm like, yeah, all roads lead to what came out of my time at UCSD, and then there's been an ongoing exploration of each of those roads as time has progressed. And after I graduated, there's a there's like a recurrent theme of essentially capsizing my career, you know. And so instead of like going from college to graduate school, I went from college to running a martial arts school. Which, you know, the sensible thing would have been to go from that school to graduate school, and I went from that school to realizing that I just wanted to, I couldn't continue doing such hardcore scholastic work because all I wanted to do was like train all day and surf all day and do martial arts all day, and that quickly transitioned into me living in a martial arts school for a few years, learning how to teach, and then running a martial arts school for a few years, and then taking trips to China to visit Shaolin Temple. And that was interesting too because that it was like a it's an American Kempo system, but because at that time it was like Shaolin Disneyland, like Shaolin Temple got taken over by the new abbot, and they were trying to promote it all over the world. So they were doing these tours, and then they would find like the biggest martial arts organization in whatever nation they were trying to like get into, and then they would create some elite. They would bond with that, and we would go to China to train over there, and then they would send monks over to the U.S. to teach at to do things, whatever. Um, and that was helpful. I mean, that was me getting connected to Chinese culture and actually being there and seeing it and learning. One key thing is that Shaolin, they would say that stuck with me is Shaolin is the combination of martial arts, medicine, and meditation. And so I think, I mean, that I like that, you know, I'm like, yeah, definitely. And seeing that, I mean, essentially Shaolin is Chan Buddhism, you know, and then the whole
Yeah.
story about Bodhidharma. Well, there's a Shaolin temple, and then it becomes the epicenter of the development of Chan Buddhism, and emerging from that, to keep the monks awake or whatever. Then they start learning the Yi Jin Jing and the Yi Sui Jing, like the muscle tendon change classic and the marrow washing classic, and the Qigong develops out of that, um, and the medicine crosses into that, and so that actually helped me get back on track. Um, because I realized my brain was kind of rotting running a martial arts school. You know, it wasn't intellectually challenging enough, really. And
Yeah.
so, um, I had been collecting all the martial arts magazines when I was running that school, and there was a magazine called Inside Kung Fu, and in Inside Kung Fu, um, there was an article about a professor at UCI called Shin Lin, and one of the quotes like one of the quotes was, "I'm just a nerdy professor who really knows how to fight." And I just shut it in the back of my mind that there was somebody really interesting over there at UCI. And eventually I destroyed my knee. You know, I blew my knee, tore my ACL and tore my meniscus, and was just like, I'm done. You know, I know what's going to happen if I try to teach through this and continue. And so I just turned that into my retirement. And then I went over to Dr. Lin's lab, and you know, I had good qualifications. Dr. Lin's lab at UCI, the mind body lab, the what is it called, the elevator speech is, or the explanation is, um, we were studying the physiological correlates of the qi phenomenon in Tai Chi, Qigong, and meditation masters. Although it
Wow.
expanded out to a lot of different things, we ended up looking at like the effect of acupuncture through with the devices that we had. So we were using like EKGs, electrocardiogram, EEG, electroencephalogram, a laser Doppler flowmeter. Like a laser Doppler is typically like what the speed gun is that the cop uses to measure you
Mhm.
speeding. And so the laser Doppler flowmeter would measure um, like the rate of blood flow and the concentration of blood flow at the point you put the probes on. So it was a way of measuring superficial blood flow. And then we had a FLIR camera, an infrared camera, so we could measure skin temperature. And then we have more esoteric things like the Kirlian camera that measures some type of bioenergy, and and then we had an actual biophoton meter that measured the photon emission from the body. Our meter was set up to measure photon emission from the hand. We had this guy Gaetan. Gaetan is at UCSD again now, and he's a physicist. So Gaetan was like essential in setting up some of these instruments because they were, particularly the biophoton meter. Gaetan was like a hardcore, very brilliant PhD in physics, and brought his own background in interesting studies. And so that lab was Dr. Lin, and then Gaetan would come in like once a week or something, and I was there every day. I was like the guy that would set up all the instruments and do the recordings, and kind of like you, right? Like doing the. Well, I'm like, you get all the data, and then you have to edit it.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you could record reams of data with like 6 different instruments, and then
Yep.
and then it would be just in there with all the data. And so passing through that lab, we had so many incredible practitioners. One of the people I met was Chen Zhenlei. Chen Zhenlei is one of the 4 tigers of Chen Village. Chen Zhenlei is close friends with Dr. Lin, and at the time I was pretty good friends with him too. I would anyway. And other more obscure people, less famous people that had like spectacular talents. A very
Mhm.
interesting time, um, I didn't know, I came from, I had the proper education because I had the neuroscience background, and Dr. Lynn's hardcore. He's like, if you don't have a 3.7 GPA and a medicine, and you're not going to medical school, you can't work in my lab, and I'm like, so it was a good environment. It was, everybody was very nerdy and but I kind of lost my train of thought trying to like brag about how smart we all were. A lot of really impressive people, very special talents, and interesting things were discovered. Oh yeah, so what I was going to say was I was like a martial arts guy. I was like, yeah, we're gonna figure out what the monks do when they break iron bars over their head. That was what I thought
Yeah.
about like Qigong. I'm like, oh, we're studying the Qigong, and so and I've been to Shaolin Temple and seen all their breaking demos, and I'm like, yeah, and anyway, so yes. And Dr. Lin had been studying things about tensin and integrin, these things about the intracellular matrix, and how they polymerize, and it was in cancer. And so I was thinking that must be part of the mechanism. And in the end, we just started studying like meditation and the internal arts, and not like breaking phenomenon, breaking feats of whatever. And so it was very, very different. It actually helped me a lot introduce and open up that domain, the domain of the internal arts, of the mind body practice, in a very like intention based way. Because the goal that what was most interesting was how people could induce physiological changes in their body without moving. And that
Hmm.
became kind of a requirement, because like if you have an EKG and an EEG on somebody and they start moving, they just create tons of artifacts, and then the whole
Yeah.
recording is destroyed by a movement artifact. And so having the quote unquote subject be stationary was very important to get a good quality data. We would try. We had some interesting experiences studying the Tai Chi masters, doing their full like routines, and then I would have to go through and like edit the data to try to remove the movement artifacts, or just crop it, crop out all the destroyed segments so that there was some studyable data that wasn't damaged by the movement artifacts. But anyway, it's interesting to see, because it also gives insight into all the I want to use the F word, but I'll say trickery because the other one is the F word with the uri at the end of it, which is like what happens in that world because you have all these Qigong masters doing fake stuff, like fake and stuff.
Yes.
Right. And we would have those people come in and they would try to do their fake stuff, and they could like quickly figure out how to like game the system and somehow, and I would have to like, and we would be recording everything that they were doing and then going back. And so something interesting would happen in the recording. And then you'd go back and like watch the video and you'd see the person doing something, some kind of movement to induce the change, and really realizing a lot of this was something else that emerges from that is in that kind of study, like doing a scientific research, what the desired outcome is. It's not completely unbiased, or it's a struggle with bias because you know what the desired outcome is. And I would get data that totally supported the desired outcome being, I want these changes. I want someone's doing deep breathing and and their heart rate is going like this, like up and down. This is called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. When you
Hmm.
inhale, uh, your heartbeat speeds up, and when you exhale, it slows down. So even if you're breathing, even if your heart rate is like quote unquote 60 beats a minute, it's actually probably oscillating from like 55 beats to 65 beats as you. And this is actually a measure of someone's like parasympathetic nervous system activity, is how much the heart rate changes through each respiratory cycle. And so we would want to see that phenomenon penetrate through to the other measures. So someone's doing deep breathing and there's this cycle happening. And then we want to look at we had another thing called the AMICS, was an instrument for measuring skin conductance. And it's particularly designed to measure skin conductance at Jing well points,
Oh
which is
wow.
another whole other subject. And so ideally you would see somebody, and as they did this, the respiration is oscillating. Ideally the skin temperature would be oscillating, and then ideally the skin conductance will be oscillating, because in the end all these things are related. As the skin temperature goes up, the skin conductance goes up, the infrared emission goes up, and the opposite is true when the temperature goes down. Um, and and the, and so it's not always the case. Most people can induce the respiratory sinus arrhythmia, the oscillation and the pulse due to the deep breathing, but it won't penetrate out to the skin into these superficial phenomenon. But some people can. Um, some of the good masters could do that. Some people have more. Some people are born with kind of more of an innate ability to do it, and so sometimes things would happen where there'd be some kind of movement artifact that would get picked up in the skin conductance or in the infrared that would create an oscillatory signal that would look like that, that it was happening, and it wasn't happening. It was just some kind of artifact, like the fingers were rubbing together like this. And so the skin conductance was changing because the pressure on the pad was going up and down. And you'd have to observe all those things because you'd be like, "Oh my God, it's the result I want," and you'd see things like some relationship between like the heart and small intestine channel, like one conductance going up and one conductance going down, and it was really just the finger rolling onto the table and off the table. And so you're like, "Oh my God, it's this yin yang relationship that's being demonstrated," and it wasn't actually that. It was all a movement artifact. And it relates to so much of what we see, right? Because that whole thing about how data is manipulated, how you can create data that isn't reproducible, but by gaming the system, essentially. Back then, we would see people doing like external chi experiments. They would do the external chi, like someone's emitting chi onto cancer cells in a petri dish, and they would publish those things, and then they could never reproduce it. And that was where Dr. Lin actually started, was thinking that he was going to piggyback on that, and then that was going to be the way. And not that doesn't happen and has never happened or can't happen, but there is a significant amount of that data which is just corrupt and totally BS. But yeah, so I think that that's an interesting thing. That was an interesting thing to something to say about Dr. Lin. I guess it relates to one of my potential discussions was about integrity, and Dr. Lin had perfect integrity. He completely promoted my me being in there and destroying all the hopes and dreams of our lab essentially every time we got like what looked like this magical data, and then I would determine that it was due to some movement artifact, and it was the completely appropriate thing to do, you know, and to really hold the data up to the highest standard. And he had the highest standard. I mean, his he had already made his whole career, so he wasn't dependent upon any kind of result we were finding. He just, and also it's important because he'd seen so many other people publish papers, then have to retract them, or have their lifelong integrity besmirched because they tied their horse around some totally fake thing, and a lot of that happens. A lot of people use those instruments like we were using. People will use those skin conductance meters as a diagnostic tool. And people with a lot of integrity that have invested a lot of time into study. And it's interesting how they get trapped into these things. And it's a difficult thing. The reality is, we would have people anyway. Yeah, I mean, this is probably not necessary to go down that path any further. But yeah, I met a lot of really cool people in that lab, and that opened. And so, one of the other things that was interesting was um, I was training with a bunch of real martial arts people. They were really into kicking people's butts, and and not all of them were into much else. They thought because they could kick people's butts, that was the be all end all, and that was pretty much the way they communicated. If they could kick your butt, then you just had to do what they told you to do, um, which was frequently something that wasn't actually very moral or ethical, or they would engage in behavior that wasn't moral or ethical because they could get away with it because they could kick everybody's butt. And it's I don't think that's very admirable. I mean, it's essentially the might is right sensibility, which is a common theme among humanity and mankind, right? If we see it playing out over and over again through various iterations of soft power or hard power, it's like if you can influence people through just pervasive media or through the threat of violence, then it must be okay what you're doing because you know, no one is stopping you. But we go back to like the philosophies that we have, and a lot of what is at the heart of most world religions essentially, and it's notions of virtue and morality and ethical behavior, and uh, and this is part of the cultivation practice, and and a lot of the people that came into the lab like were highly skilled, qigong and Tai Chi people, and we had some abbots of different temples, and there was something different about them. Like some of those guys actually could fight and could probably handle some serious business, but at the same point, they were very virtuous, and they had a very different vibe about them. A different aspiration. It wasn't just about power. It was their aspirations were more towards character development, and I needed that. I still need that, and so it appeals to me, and and so I got to be around them, and then I would. And so part of understanding what was happening within them was having conversations about them about what they were practicing, and so me and Dr. Lin are looking at these things through a very Western physiological method, but they're explaining it through classical TCM language or classical Chinese philosophical language, or the jargon of the internal arts and the internal landscape, and so that led me into studying all of that, and then studying with a lot of those masters, in order to better understand what they were doing and how to describe it in physiological terms, and how to see how that connected to the physiological changes that we were seeing as a result of their practice, and seeing all these connections, like the biomarkers for the type of transformations that are occurring as a product of the internal arts. And that's very different. That was good for me because like I came from this kind of background that was very materialistic in a way. You know, like you go surf, you can't swim, you drown. You know, I mean, at some point, you go play martial arts, you can't fight, you get beat up. You know, you
Yeah,
go do
definitely.
internal arts, you can just wear a fancy robe and say whatever you want to say. You know, and 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 it's not so the quantification of someone's skill isn't so obvious, and not that the measurements that we were doing in that lab are the be all end all of quantification of someone's ability in the internal arts, but it was a little window into that, you know. It also
Can I
helped me
can I ask
develop
you?
like a profile for who.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can I ask you a question then? Yeah, because this is an interesting thing. I a couple of years ago here in Vietnam, there was a Qigong master, and he was coming out, and there were all these videos of him just waving his hands around and people shaking in his school. And it in because I'm based in Southeast Asia, and in Vietnam, a lot of people were like, "Dude, what is going on here?" But then you get someone like a Wim Hof, and I know he's not a Qigong master, but I don't know if you've researched him, but like I've heard that this guy is walking up and down Mount
yeah, I'm
Everest.
familiar.
There are not Everest.
Yeah,
He climbed
yeah,
Mont Blanc or something in just shorts.
yeah. Some large mountain in his skivvies. Yeah,
Yeah,
in his
and
underwear.
in his underwear, and and
Did
it's
some
like
crazy thing
he's
across Africa too. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so excuse me, but there
Yeah,
are
these
these
that's
people.
like the really extreme manifestation of what we were studying, like that ability to modulate the external body temperature in order to resist cold, and to use respiratory mechanics to modulate the nervous system in order to cause changes in the immune system. So we can upregulate activity of T cells in order to fight particular viruses, and it's interesting because there's no real esoteric philosophy to it,
Yeah,
which is another thing that emerges from that study, which I questioned because I still study the esoterica, you know. But there's always that evaluation, trying to figure out um, what is the wheat and what is the chaff.
yeah,
Because you can study all the esoterica in the world, and you're like, is this necessary, or do I just need to like do the Wim Hof huff and like whatever, you know?
yeah,
Yeah, it's more than I can describe. Um,
yeah,
but there's a lot because there was a lot of just trick things that I learned in the lab that I mean, it's always some combination of that. There is a very physical skill, and then there's an associated visualization and some theoretical system, and trying to figure out, like where the value lies and where to invest your time, and
yeah,
yeah, I feel like most of what you should invest in is in there's a physical reality, a physical practice, and these skills to modify your physiology, and that's the foundational practice. But the Taoist school would say that your moral cultivation is the fundamental practice.
right.
One of the things I was thinking about, because I've been studying like with the Chuanzhen Longmen, the Parting Cloud school that Dr. Hoffman is a ordained priest in, and
Yeah,
we learn about the internal deities, and so I'm a heretic. I'm just a beginner, and I wonder. Well, one of the things I think about is what is the difference between looking inside and imagining the terrain and imagining the deities versus looking inside and seeing the deities and seeing the terrain? Because in the world that we live in, it seems like there's a difference, right? Like I look outside and I see the terrain, and the terrain is what I see. But when I can look inside and I can see the Disneyland that's in Anaheim, but I know that's me imagining it. But I think through cultivation and practice and very deep deeply repeating the experience. There's a way to move from imagining to seeing. And
Yeah.
this has to do with differences in states of consciousness. And in TCM, I mean, in Chinese medicine, we would talk about the Hun and the Hun traveling. And if I'm not connected to my Hun and I'm just kind of in my head and I'm in my conscious mind, I'm just imagining things. But if I
Yeah.
can connect with my Hun and my Hun is traveling, then potentially I can be seeing, and it's a difference
Mm-hmm.
between conscious practice and subconscious practice. And this kind of relates to some of those phenomenon. Like you could relate to like Kobe Bryant scoring like 100 points in a game, where you
Yeah.
go into the zone and you're manifesting your skill without thinking about it. And this is a product of endless repetition, and so like coming full circle, you see that there's a way of describing the terrain and the change in the subconsciousness and relating that to aspects of the Hun. But then there's also people, whole cultures that are going to have those experiences, and they're not going to think of it in terms of the Hun.
No.
And I think there's always going to be some type of measurable change in the brain and change in the nervous system and change in likely everything else in the immune system and the endocrine system. And very interesting and just thinking about that, I think that, I guess it relates to the question of, we think about mind, body, and spirit, and frequently there's like, you set aside space for like separation where you're like, well, this thing happens in the mind, but it doesn't happen in the body. And this thing happens in the spirit and it doesn't happen in the mind or the body. And it's like, I think that all those things happen in every level at the same time, and like a spiritual phenomenon reflects as a physical change in the physical body, and change in the physical body reflects as it changes in the mind and spirit. And so there's no separation. Every signal transduces up and down, how, if you see it in that type of hierarchy. Back to what you were asking about, I had a funny story about not about Vietnam, but about guys, masters making their students or disciples or hangers on flop
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We had a guy come to the lab that was like that. He was a guy from Hong Kong, and he came in and he had like 4 or 5 of his students,
Yeah.
disciples, fans. I don't know. It was weird because he would do the thing. He would like be like, and they would start flying around the room and like
Yeah.
bouncing off the filing cabinets and stuff and banging into the tables. And he was like, he didn't make any bones about it. We're like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I just wave my hands around, and they start moving around because they think that's what they're supposed to do. And it was interesting because um, he had his clinic in Hong Kong. He would do Qi healing.
Yeah.
And there sometimes there's this path where these people, they have this great skill, because I had a teacher like that. He had great skill. And he was one of the people I met in the lab, and he was amazing. He could immediately go into the state and go through his get into the subconscious and get into theta waves and start emitting all kinds of light and stuff. And I went and trained with him, and he was so gracious and kind and generous, and we trained really well, like a couple nights a week, and really learned how to induce the phenomenon that he was manifesting. And because he was so good, a ton of people came to him, and then he started getting famous, and he was in Newport Beach, and then like rich people in Newport Beach was like, hey, I don't want to go to the clinic. Why don't you come to my house? I'll just pay you 10 times as much. And so then he starts making a ton of money. And then his face changes, and now he's wearing these like Gucci sunglasses, and he had the ramrod straight posture, like he was like connecting heaven and earth. But then he starts making a ton of money, and now his posture's broken, his face doesn't look right anymore. he's
Oh
and then
man.
he's like sleeping with the secretary while he's
Okay.
married and stuff. And but he's suddenly really wealthy, but he doesn't have it anymore. He's kind of lost it. And I can't, and I also think, I don't hold it against him. I'm like, this guy, because part of his story was he grew up, in some rural part of China, and there was not so much, and what he had was his practice and his cultivation, and that was what made him great, you know. And then he came to the U.S. and he's like, I don't want to, I don't know, I want what you have, you know. I want the money and the fancy car and a big house. I don't want to hang out in the forest and like cultivate, you know. Like, you
Yeah.
know, and because I grew up in like a big house, you know, with a car and everything, and but I wanted what he had, you know, and he wanted, you know, so I see that, you know. So I think in the story about the Hong Kong guy, it's similar. Like he had great skill, and he was really doing stuff, and he was like emitting his chi, and was able to help people. And then he gets famous, and there's like a lot of pressure on him, and he's also, and so that take and so this other thing comes into the picture, which is the placebo effect, because people know he's amazing and he's famous for it, and they come to him knowing that he's going to help them because everybody's told them
Yeah.
that. And so all he
Yep.
has to do is like wave his hands at them, and then it happens because they believe it's going to happen. And so he told us about how he had this thing. He had like the super chi effect, the super chi treatment, where he would give like 10 times the chi, and it cost 10 times as much, and the people would get 10 times as better, 10 times better. And when we ask him, you know, what do you do differently? He's like, I don't do anything differently. I just charge 10 times as much. And they think it's 10 times as good because they paid 10 times as much, and then they get way better because of it, you know? And so he was so cynical or just honest about it. It was really interesting, and it shed some light into a few of those different issues, one being the effect of placebo, and also understanding that like sometimes placebo can seem like a bad word, right? Like, oh, that was
Yeah.
placebo effect, particularly in like the acupuncture studies, you know. You're like, well, that Virum acupuncture was no better than sham acupuncture, or it was no better than placebo acupuncture. And you're like, well, I mean, the placebo acupuncture was still just as good as the medication, you know. Like for like in the
Yeah.
back pain study, one of the back pain studies is like the acupuncture, sham acupuncture and Virum acupuncture are not really different in efficacy, but they're both just as good as the pharmaceutical medication.
Yeah, it's this is fascinating, man. Normally, I'm asking more questions, but this is literally one of the most interesting things that I've listened to in a while because it's really fascinating. And it's like I remember Bill Moyers had this documentary ages ago, and like he was
Yeah,
meeting these people in China, and they were doing
yeah,
all of these phenomenon. And I continued to come back to it. How much of this is real? How much of this is imagined? How much of this? And it's amazing that you guys were studying this.
yeah. You know, I mean, in that video, one of our famous practitioners is in that video. One of the guy Andrew Nugent Head. He's in North
Really?
Carolina in Asheville, and so he was in Beijing for like 20 years or something, and he went there to study. I don't want to tell his story, but he's in the video, and so he somewhere, you know, in the records, he tells about his experience there, you know. And I will tell my something about my experience
Yeah.
because it's in a way echoing his, you know. You go there, and you want to learn from this guy, you know, because he's famous, because he's got a lineage, because he has a tradition, because you this is like how we think about the Chinese martial arts. Like I want to study with the famous master, and I want to become his
Yes.
disciple, and I want to become a lineage holder, and therefore I have to give face to the master. I have to go along to get along, you know.
Yeah.
And when he's going to demonstrate, you know what effect he wants to induce on you, and you don't really want to like show out your ability to resist or not succumb to his influence, you know, because then he's not going to tell you the secrets, and you're not going to ingratiate yourself to him and to the system, and you're going to become a pariah, and all of your efforts will be lost, you know. And it's this happens, right? I mean, this is part of the thing that is a hero worship phenomenon, or part of any system, you know. A lot of times when people, if you want to climb the ladder in the system, a lot of times you sacrifice some part of your ability to stand against the system to
Hmm.
kind of try to make it into some kind of global thing. But just you know, just within the Chinese cultural arts, there's a lot of succumbing to the influences, you know, and that can lead to some of these things that you'll see, like they do the empty force where you don't touch the person and they go hopping around.
Yeah.
And they know that that's the desired effect. And so, and so there's conditioning that happens. People may not even know that consciously they're doing this. They just have like assimilated the understanding that this is the result. I think it's possible for there to be real phenomenon there. I think it could possibly happen. My belief is that people don't really have any imagination. Everything that we
Mm,
think actually happened at some point. Like all the magical stuff. At some point, somebody could do it. All of
yeah.
the stories that you hear, there was probably some truth to all that stuff. Whether or not it still happens or not, I think that a lot of the phenomenon that seem supernatural are much more difficult to achieve these days because we're conditioned into the super normal. It's not part of our cultural belief system that you can levitate boulders or throw fireballs or teleport, or and so I think in order to access those skills, you have to overcome all that conditioning, and as
Mm,
the information landscape that we're in becomes even thicker and thicker, it makes it more and more difficult, and the deconditioning and I think there's probably some type of aspect of global consciousness that squeezes those potentials out too, where everybody believes it's not possible. And so
yeah.
therefore it's not possible, or it's that much more difficult, because yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting and trying to be mindful of that line, like what what conclusions can I actually draw from what I've observed? And does that mean I can rule certain potentialities out? Not really. It doesn't mean I can rule things out. It just means that I've seen I have some explanations for some phenomenon,
Right.
and ideally the explanations lead to, because the ideal is that by understanding the mechanisms, then you can refine the practice. And that goes back to understanding like the wheat from the chaff, right? I think that was the end game on
Yeah.
a lot of that stuff. Like you see a lot of inevitably any movement art is going to have unnecessary movements in it, and some of it is signature things where you're talking you're telling a story that like the salutation and some kata, or in the forms in the Chinese martial art. This is how you're signifying your family, and it has that meaning. And then not everything has to be very substantial, and but ideally you would know the difference, you would know, and
Definitely.
there and therefore you would know what to invest your time in, and seeing those things as they
Well,
are.
that this leads me to kind of a roundup question. As people are getting into this, and you've been studying a lot of this for a long time, what would you say is worth the time for people to invest their time in for cultivating themselves and this type of practice? What do you think is really worth people's time? I mean, obviously, I want to create fireballs.
I
Like,
think on one
let's be
hand
real.
it's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's a good leading idea, right? Like, what is the most efficient way for me to develop a skill set that will allow me to create fireballs?
Right.
And it's probably not to just wave your hand at a piece of paper till the paper lights on fire. There's probably some kind of linear progression from skill to skill to skill to skill to eventually you reach this thing where that might be more. Because there's also like the trickery where you have whatever, it's like some mineral, and because you'll see
Yeah.
I don't remember the chemical explanation, but there's a way to like put the right little mineral like salt and some other highly combustible metal or something on the paper so that when you wave your hand at it, it like catches fire. So there's a trickery. There's a very direct method, very simple method to just learn how to make something ignite, But on the other hand, yeah, like and so I was going to say, I think it's like medicine in some sense where, there's no ideal method for everybody. People have their character inclines them to certain practices. And so, because I don't necessarily, because if you just like force a square peg in a round hole, it's just going to create resistance. So I have to find
Yeah.
practices, and especially initially, that resonate with the person, that like I don't like meditating, and I need to meditate, and because it doesn't, I think too much, and there's also like I'm prone to anxiety, and so I'm better with the movement arts, and so like this the soft entry for me is that, well, you should do the movement arts, and then what would be beneficial is to do things very repetitive because you're moving, but now you're doing something that's trance inducing through the repetition, and I can occupy my mind by observing all the details of the movement. We're here and this weight and and this turn, and then here, and then the weight distribution and my spine and my heel, and and then at some point it's not this. It becomes like it's an energetic movement, and then
Yes.
this movement gets smaller, and now I can monitor something very small, and now I've put all this the 10th, then the 1,000 thoughts become one thought, and now and now hopefully I can pass through that door and move into something more internal, and now I have an internal practice, and maybe I have to start over again where something more dynamic is happening. I'm stationary now, but I'm observing. I collect the 5 elements, and then I build my cauldron, and out of I use the wood to light the fire, and then I use the wood to melt the metal to form the cauldron, and then the fire's there and the earth is there. I use the earth to make the furnace to make the fire, and so using all the whatever that process is. And I have the cauldron, and then I collect all the things and put them in the cauldron, and then I have made the sublimation occur, and I collect that, and now that jewel is I put into my Tanjong, into Ren 17, into the heart chakra, and so on and so forth. And then at some point, it's none of that, and it's just observing the quote unquote jewel, And this is a path towards similar to like my path, essentially, like how something that will work for me and what is beneficial for me is um, refining my nature is becoming not intellectual and not wanting to ruminate on everything, and ref- and so I have to. For me, what's natural is to work through that, from where I am to where I want to be in a stepwise fashion. And I think as I get to the point where I can just have the single mindedness, because some of the practice in the lab was like one of the things that you measure is brain waves, and brain waves start like rapid brain waves. Beta waves, like 30 hertz, is very normal for someone. Alpha waves, I start focusing a little. The brain waves slow down to like 12 hertz. I think it's between 12 and 20 hertz or something like that, times a second. Then I get into theta, and theta is typically where you move into parasympathetic dominance, where I would say the internal arts start, where you're kind of in what's called the zone. And from that point, when you have like the brainwaves in the frontal cortex are theta, and then you're showing something with a lot of parasympathetic activity, you've reduced the stress. From there, I can start, maybe the 1,000 thoughts have slowed down, and I can start focusing on one thing. And as you focus on the one thing, eventually you get to that other transitional stage, which is moving into delta. And I think delta kind of corresponds with something that you talk about in the Zen traditions, where in the Chan, in like the Sutra of Huineng, where they taught where it's like I call it the Buddhism's great rap battle, where it was Huineng, I think it's Shen Shui, which is like the other potential inheritor of the robe and bowl. And like Shen Shui says this thing where he's like, oh yeah, it's like the Bodhi tree, and then I have to keep wiping the dust off the mirror. And then Huineng comes along and he's like, no, there's no mirror. You don't have to wash the dust off of it. And this is about observing the self. And so there's some level where I'm always still observing the self, and I get it down to like one thought. But at some point, there's no observation of anything at all. There's no emergent phenomenon. You're actually inhabiting nothingness. And this is I think that's a required step. And it's also like a gateway where all these practices are like moving through courtyards in the Imperial Palace where you're at the outer courtyard and then you move through a gate and you're closer and you move through a gate and then you move through a gate. And the reality is it's almost the other story is that the thing like every time every step you take, you'll be halfway to the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, but you know, and so the first step you're like halfway there. The second step you're halfway there. The third step and it's almost like getting to the inside of to the inner courtyard. There's always another court to get into. It's the first steps are you cover way more distance. It's so much easier, and then you start getting further into it. And where do I go from absolute nothingness? Well, from absolute nothingness, ideally things will emerge. Things emerge spontaneously. Things emerge that are not a product of my conscious mind. And this is a lot of the realization, the trigger, the message. Um, a lot of interesting things can happen at that level. I think a lot of true spiritual phenomenon manifests itself, and this becomes kind of circles back to that idea: what's the difference between imagining and seeing? Because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times people imagine they're having a spiritual experience, and they haven't actually got kind of. And again, I leave space for other paths and other practices and other experiences, but in my experience and kind of what I distill is that idea that um, getting to that point, what is emerging is something you will see. It's not something you're imagining. And
Mm-hmm.
understanding how to differentiate those phenomenon is a key thing. Because again, going back to bias, like you'll know what your practice is and you'll know what the desired outcomes of your practice are. You'll have some idea about who you are and what you want the triggers to be, what you want the messages to be. And so you'll just deliver them. You're like, hey, and
Yeah,
then it was amazing. I was doing a practice. Yeah. And so anyway, um, yeah,
that's a masterclass.
that's the thing.
Man, well,
Yeah.
this has been a deep dive into some awesomeness. I really appreciate it. But I think that it looks at things that I had questions that I've always had, and throughout my studies of the martial arts and seeing people with diving into the internal martial arts. And it's awesome that people are out there doing this research. It's awesome that people are really looking at this. And yeah, powerful, because yeah, man, I want to be shooting fireballs. And it's it's awesome.
I want to shoot rays of healing energy.
There we go. That's
I mean,
probably way more altruistic. That's
there's
probably
so much
what I should be.
potential.
Right? There's so much potential.
I mean, maybe I think that one is probably just a signpost on the pathway to the other. I'm not sure which
Right?
is the higher level skill. I think that maybe the fire, but I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. It's awesome either
That's
way.
a whole other story. Yeah.
Right?